He said she'd ruined his life with that pregnancy. But 5 years later, the millionaire CEO saw the little girl with his eyes, and everything stopped. The boardroom was silent, except for the steady hum of the city far below. The tension in the air felt like glass, thin, fragile, ready to shatter with one wrong word. Christian Blake stood by the tall window, his reflection cast against the skyline of Manhattan. Every inch the man he had built himself to be, powerful, flawless, untouchable. His blonde hair caught the light from the city, and his icy blue eyes, usually calm and calculating, now blazed with anger. Emma stood across the room, clutching a small folded paper in her trembling hand. The words she had rehearsed over and over vanished from her tongue the moment he looked at her. She had always admired his confidence, his precision, the way his presence could command a room. But now all she saw was a stranger, a man whose success had stripped him of compassion. "You ruined my life with this pregnancy," he shouted, the word striking her like a blow. He didn't mean to raise his voice, but the anger, the fear, the loss of control, everything he'd buried under his empire, burst free in one brutal sentence. Emma flinched, but she didn't cry. She couldn't. Not here, not in front of him. She had known this conversation would be hard, but she hadn't expected such cruelty. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The air felt heavy, thick with everything unsaid. She looked at him, at the man she had once loved, the man who used to make her laugh over cheap takeout at midnight, before the company, before the power, before he became someone else. "Christian," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This isn't just about you." He turned away, running a hand through his hair, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. "You think I can just drop everything? Do you have any idea what's at stake right now? My reputation, my career, everything I've built." His words were sharp, each one like a shard of ice piercing the space between them. Emma wanted to scream, to tell him that his reputation wouldn't keep him warm at night, that his empire meant nothing compared to the tiny heartbeat growing inside her, but she knew it was useless. The man standing in front of her wasn't the Christian who had held her hand when she was scared, who had whispered that he didn't believe in love until her. That man was gone. Her eyes burned, but she blinked the tears away. "I didn't plan this," she said quietly. "I thought you had a right to know." He laughed bitterly, his voice hollow. "A right? You think you're doing me a favor by telling me this? You're destroying everything." He slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the room like a thunderclap. She took a small step back, not from fear, but from the realization that this was the end. The end of everything they had, everything she thought they could be. She turned toward the door, her legs shaking beneath her. "I'll go," she murmured, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry the weight of her decision. "But you'll regret this one day, Christian. Maybe not today. Maybe not soon, but you will." He didn't answer. He didn't even look at her as she walked out. The door closed softly behind her, and in that sound, gentle, final, something inside both of them broke. Christian stayed by the window long after she left, staring out at the city lights, trying to convince himself that he'd done the right thing. He told himself that he didn't need anyone, that love was a weakness he couldn't afford. But as the minutes turned into hours and the office grew dark, the echo of her voice haunted him. Somewhere deep down, a quiet, unwelcome thought began to form, one he quickly pushed away. Outside, Emma stepped into the cold night air. The city roared around her, but she felt numb, like the noise belonged to another world. She pressed a hand to her stomach, her fingers trembling. "We'll be okay," she whispered to the life growing inside her. "I promise." The wind caught her hair, and for the first time in her life, she didn't know where she was going. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she was done chasing love that came with conditions. She would build her life from scratch, even if it broke her. Back upstairs, Christian poured himself a drink and sat at his desk. But the amber liquid did nothing to drown the bitterness. He thought about her eyes, the way they had looked at him, not with anger, but with disappointment. That look tore deeper than her words. Somewhere in his chest, a crack formed, small but real. He didn't know it yet, but that moment would come back to him years later, when the world he had built around himself began to crumble under the weight of what he'd lost. The city was behind her now, its noise and lights fading into a distant blur as Emma sat on the nearly empty bus that would take her to a small coastal town she had only seen once on a map. Her hands rested protectively on her stomach, her mind spinning with what had just happened. She had left everything behind, her job, her apartment, her friends, and yet she felt strangely calm. The tears had stopped somewhere along the drive, leaving only exhaustion and a quiet, steady resolve. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Christian's face, the coldness in his eyes, the way he looked at her like she was an inconvenience instead of someone he once said he couldn't live without. She tried to hate him, but love doesn't turn to hate that quickly. It fades slowly, painfully, leaving behind a ghost that follows you everywhere. When she arrived in the small town of Brighton Bay, the air smelled like salt and rain. The sea stretched endlessly before her, gray and calm, and for the first time in weeks, she could breathe. She found a tiny one-bedroom apartment above a bakery, its walls cracked and its windows drafty, but it was hers. The landlord, an older woman named Mrs. Collins, looked at her with kind eyes and asked no questions when she saw the pregnancy test box sticking out of Emma's bag. "You'll be all right here," she said softly, handing her the keys. "The sea has a way of healing what people break." Emma smiled faintly, though she wasn't sure she believed it yet. That night, as she lay on the narrow bed, listening to the sound of waves against the shore, she whispered a silent promise to the tiny life growing inside her, that she would never let her child feel unwanted, not the way she had just been made to feel. The following months were hard, but they also gave Emma something she hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. She started working part-time at a local bookstore, spending her days surrounded by the comforting smell of old paper and the quiet hum of stories that weren't hers. The people in the town began to recognize her, greet her, smile at her gently in the mornings. They didn't know who she was or what she had left behind, and she liked it that way. She was no longer the woman who worked for a billionaire or the one who cried in his office. She was simply Emma, the woman who walked along the beach every evening and smiled at strangers. As her belly grew, she began to talk to her baby. It started as whispers, shy at first, but soon it became a nightly ritual. She'd sit by the window, the moonlight falling across her face, and she'd tell stories about hope, about kindness, about second chances. Sometimes she would imagine what her child would look like. Would they have Christian's piercing blue eyes? His crooked smile that only showed when he forgot to be serious? The thought made her heart ache, but she never allowed bitterness to win. She wanted her child to grow up surrounded by love, not resentment. There were nights when the loneliness felt unbearable. She'd wake from dreams where he was still there holding her, whispering that everything would be all right. But the bed beside her was cold, and the only heartbeat she could hear was the one inside her. On those nights, she'd walk down to the beach barefoot, the sand cool beneath her feet, and watch the waves crash over and over, as if reminding her that life never stopped moving. It hurt, but it also gave her strength. Meanwhile, miles away, Christian threw himself into work as if success could erase memory. He stayed later at the office, closed deals that made headlines, and filled his schedule so completely that there was no room for silence. But no matter how hard he worked, the emptiness followed him. He told himself he didn't care where Emma went or what she did. Yet sometimes, when he walked past the window of a cafe or heard someone laugh the way she used to, something inside him twisted painfully. He had convinced himself that love was a distraction, that family was a trap. But what he didn't understand was that the trap he feared had already closed around his own heart. 9 months later, under a soft gray sky, Emma gave birth to a baby girl. The moment she heard that first cry, everything inside her changed. The exhaustion, the fear, the heartbreak, all of it disappeared in an instant. The nurse placed the baby in her arms, and Emma looked down at her daughter for the first time. She had tiny hands, a shock of light blonde hair, and when her eyes opened, they were the clearest blue she had ever seen. Emma couldn't breathe for a second. Those were his eyes. For a moment, she felt the old ache return, sharp and deep, but then the baby made a small sound, and it pulled her back to the present. "Lily," she whispered. "Your name is Lily." In that fragile, perfect moment, Emma realized that love hadn't died the day Christian turned his back on her. It had simply changed form. It was still alive, burning quietly in her arms in the steady beat of the tiny heart pressed against her chest. She kissed her daughter's forehead and closed her eyes, letting tears finally fall, not from pain, but from a strange, overwhelming gratitude. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel abandoned. She felt chosen. The first spring after Lily was born came quietly, as if the world itself wanted to move gently around Emma. The apartment above the bakery always smelled of fresh bread, and the old window rattled when the sea winds picked up, but it was home, and that was enough. Emma had grown thinner, but stronger, her eyes carrying that kind of calm that only came after surviving a storm. The early days of motherhood were chaos wrapped in tenderness, nights without sleep, mornings filled with tiny cries and soft laughter that could dissolve her exhaustion in a heartbeat. Sometimes she would sit in the rocking chair with Lily in her arms, the baby's head resting on her shoulder, and the world outside would disappear completely. Yet even in those peaceful moments, there was a shadow that lingered, the memory of Christian's voice, the harshness in his words, the finality of that moment. She tried to bury it, but grief has a way of finding cracks in the heart. Time moved differently in Brighton Bay. The days felt longer, slower, and people smiled at her without expecting anything in return. Emma found work as an assistant in the same bookstore she'd been visiting since she arrived. The owner, a kind man named Daniel, often told her she had the eyes of someone who'd seen too much but hadn't given up yet. She'd smile and say that maybe he was right. In the quiet moments between shelving books, she'd hum softly to Lily, who sat in a stroller near the counter, fascinated by the way sunlight danced across the pages. Customers adored the little girl, often bringing her small gifts, tiny bows, picture books, a seashell necklace. They didn't know the story behind those blue eyes that mirrored a man Emma swore she'd stopped loving. At night, when the shop lights went out and the streets fell silent, Emma would stand by the window, watching the horizon fade into darkness. Sometimes she'd catch herself wondering what Christian was doing at that exact moment. Was he still in his office surrounded by glass and steel, signing deals that made him richer and emptier at once? Did he ever think about her, about the child he had refused to believe in? The thought would come uninvited, like a tide she couldn't stop, but she always pushed it away before it could drown her again. She had made a choice to live in peace, and that meant letting go of questions that had no answers. When Lily turned 1, Emma baked a small cake with too much frosting and sang to her, tears blurring her vision halfway through the song. The candlelight flickered over the baby's smiling face, and Emma realized something beautiful: she wasn't sad anymore. The ache was still there, yes, but it had softened into something else, something almost warm. She wasn't alone in the world. She had someone who loved her without condition. Lily's laugh filled the room like sunlight spilling through clouds after a long rain. For the first time since she'd left New York, Emma felt that maybe she was exactly where she was meant to be. But life had a strange way of sending reminders that the past never really disappeared. One rainy afternoon, as Emma was closing the shop, Daniel handed her a newspaper left behind by a tourist. The headline across the front read, "Blake Enterprises expands to Europe. CEO named Businessman of the Year." She froze for a moment, her eyes locked on the familiar name. Christian's face stared back at her from the glossy photograph, confident, charming, surrounded by power. It was as if time hadn't touched him. Her chest tightened, but she forced herself to put the paper aside. He was a man of another world now, a world she no longer belonged to. Yet something deep inside her whispered that stories like theirs didn't end with silence. They paused, waiting for the moment to return. That night, as the rain tapped against the window and the sea roared in the distance, Emma sat with Lily asleep in her lap. She traced her daughter's tiny fingers, memorizing every curve, every soft breath, and thought about the choices that had brought her here. Maybe Christian would never know what he had lost. Maybe he would never see how those blue eyes carried his reflection. And maybe that was for the best. But as she watched the storm clouds drift across the sky, a quiet unease stirred in her. Some part of her heart, the part that had tried so hard to move on, sensed that their paths were not finished crossing. The world had a strange way of looping back on itself, of forcing people to face what they once ran from. She didn't know when or how, but she felt it deep in her bones. Someday he would see what he had walked away from. Someday the truth would find them both. 5 years had a way of slipping through one's fingers without warning. The salty air of Brighton Bay had become part of Emma's lungs. Her small bookstore job had turned into full-time work, and Lily had grown into a bright, curious little girl who carried sunshine in her laughter. At 5 years old, she was already full of questions that both delighted and broke Emma's heart, questions about the stars, about dreams, and sometimes about fathers. Emma always answered with gentle honesty, telling her that some people loved differently, that sometimes love wasn't enough to make people stay. She never mentioned Christian by name, never told Lily about the night that had shattered her life. To the little girl, her mother was the whole world, and for Emma, that was both beautiful and unbearably bittersweet. The days were long but peaceful. Mornings began with the smell of coffee and fresh bread from the bakery below, and evenings ended with Lily's small arms wrapped tightly around her mother's neck as she fell asleep. Yet, as time went on, there were nights when Emma would pause by the window, the same one she used to look through as a younger, more broken version of herself, and wonder what had become of the man who once claimed freedom mattered more than love. Sometimes she imagined him older, colder, trapped inside the empire he had built for himself. She wondered if he was happy, if success had filled the emptiness she'd glimpsed behind his eyes. Meanwhile, in the heart of New York, Christian Blake had everything a man could want, or so everyone believed. His company dominated headlines. His name was whispered in boardrooms with respect and envy, and every photograph of him was perfectly polished. But beneath the sharp suits and relentless ambition, something inside him had begun to rot. He no longer celebrated his victories. They felt hollow, like echoes in an empty room. He'd tell himself it was the price of power, that solitude was part of greatness. But the truth was simpler and crueler, he was lonely. The nights were the worst, when the city went quiet and the lights from his penthouse windows reflected back a man he didn't recognize. Sometimes in half-dreams he'd see flashes of her face, hear her laughter, and wake up breathless with an ache he couldn't name. He never admitted it to anyone, not even to himself. But every time he passed a woman with blonde hair in a crowd, his heart stuttered. Every time he caught a glimpse of blue eyes, he turned before reason could stop him. One winter evening, after another long day of meetings, Christian sat in his car outside a restaurant downtown. Snow had begun to fall, blanketing the city in white silence. He was supposed to meet a potential investor, but something in him resisted getting out of the car. He leaned his head back, eyes closed, listening to the soft hum of the heater, and for a moment he thought he heard a child's laughter somewhere nearby. It was light and pure, like the sound of something he didn't deserve to remember. He shook his head and forced himself out of the car, his polished shoes crunching against the snow-covered pavement. He didn't notice the small cafe across the street. Didn't see the woman and little girl who had stepped inside moments before he arrived. Inside that cafe, Emma was wiping snowflakes from Lily's hair as they sat by the window, sharing a cup of hot chocolate topped with too much whipped cream. The world outside was cold and gray, but inside everything felt warm, safe. Lily was chattering about the snow, her excitement infectious. "Mommy, do you think it'll snow enough to build a snowman?" she asked, her blue eyes sparkling. Emma smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Maybe tomorrow, sweetheart," she said softly. But as she glanced toward the window, her heart suddenly skipped. Across the street, framed by the glow of streetlights and falling snow, she saw him. Christian, older, sharper, but undeniably him. Her breath caught, the air leaving her lungs in a quiet gasp. The years had changed him, but not enough to erase the man she had loved. For a moment, she couldn't move. The world seemed to shrink until there was nothing but the space between them. She ducked her head quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. It had been 5 years, 5 long years of silence, and yet the mere sight of him made her feel as if she were standing in that office again, his anger still echoing in her ears. She told herself it was impossible that he'd notice her, that the city was too big, that he'd long forgotten her face. But then Lily's voice broke the moment. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Emma forced a smile, shaking her head. "Nothing, baby. Drink your cocoa before it gets cold." Yet her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the cup. She didn't look out the window again, afraid of what she might see, or what she might want to see. Across the street, Christian entered the restaurant, greeted by warm lights and polite smiles. But something tugged at him as he walked through the door, something faint but insistent, like a memory brushing past his skin. He paused, his eyes flicking toward the window behind him, but the reflection of snow made it impossible to see beyond. For a brief second, his chest tightened for reasons he couldn't explain. It felt like he had missed something important, something familiar and irreplaceable. He took a breath, straightened his coat, and forced himself to move on. That night, as the snowstorm thickened and the city lights blurred, Emma couldn't sleep. She stood by the window long after Lily had fallen asleep, watching flakes drift through the darkness. Her mind was a storm of its own, memories, regrets, and questions she thought she had buried for good. Seeing him again, even for a moment, had reopened something she didn't want to feel. She whispered to herself that it didn't matter, that she and Lily had everything they needed. But deep down she knew that fate had just stirred the still water of her carefully built peace. And somewhere across the city, in a high-rise apartment full of glass and silence, Christian lay awake too, staring at the ceiling, wondering why it suddenly felt like someone had just walked across his soul. The next morning arrived with a pale sun that cast thin light through the fogged window of the small apartment. Emma woke early, her thoughts heavy and restless after a sleepless night. The memory of the previous evening refused to leave her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Christian standing across the street, the snow swirling around him like a scene from a life that was no longer hers. She tried to convince herself it was just coincidence, that life had simply brushed her past in a cruel trick of fate, but her heart knew better. The world was too wide, too random for moments like that to be mere accidents. Something inside her trembled with the old dangerous thought that perhaps their story wasn't over. But she quickly silenced it, focusing instead on getting Lily ready for the day. The child's laughter filled the air as she tried to put on her tiny boots, her voice bright and unbothered by her mother's unease. They spent the morning at the bookstore as usual, with Lily drawing on sheets of paper behind the counter while Emma sorted through new arrivals. Yet, no matter how hard she tried to distract herself, Emma's mind kept drifting. Every face that passed by the window made her glance up too quickly. Every sound of a car outside made her pulse jump. It was foolish, she told herself. He had no reason to come here, no reason to even think of her. He had moved on, built his empire, lived his grand life surrounded by power and people who spoke his language. She was just a memory he had erased the moment she walked away. Still, as she stacked the books and pretended to read the titles, a small part of her wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, something in him had changed. Meanwhile, Christian had spent the morning pacing his office with the same unease that had haunted him all night. He didn't understand why the image of that snow-covered street wouldn't leave his mind, or why he couldn't shake the strange sense that he had been standing on the edge of something important. He tried to drown it out with work, burying himself in meetings, numbers, and contracts, but concentration kept slipping through his grasp. The boardroom felt suffocating, the faces around him distant and meaningless. For the first time in years, the thrill of control, the thing that had once defined him, felt like a burden instead of a power. His assistant noticed his distraction and asked if he was unwell, but he dismissed her politely. When the day ended, he found himself driving with no real destination, the city streets blurring past. And then, without meaning to, he found himself heading toward the part of town he hadn't visited in years, toward the quiet streets near the bay where his mind had told him not to go. Emma was just locking up the bookstore when she heard the soft chime of the bell and turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. For a heartbeat, the air left her lungs. Christian stood there, the same piercing blue eyes meeting hers, and in that moment the years fell away. He looked older, yes, his features sharper, his expression heavier, but the sight of him still sent a shock through her. He hesitated, his voice low and uncertain, as if he wasn't sure if she'd throw him out or burst into tears. "Emma," he said quietly. It was just her name, but it hit her like a wave. She didn't answer at first, frozen in place. Finally, she managed to whisper, "What are you doing here?" He stepped inside slowly, his gaze flickering around the small shop as though trying to piece together her life from its corners. "I was driving. I didn't even know where I was going," he admitted. "And then I saw you." His voice trembled slightly, and for the first time, she saw something she had never seen in him before, hesitation, maybe even regret. She crossed her arms, trying to shield herself from the confusion that rose inside her. "You shouldn't be here, Christian." "There's nothing left to say." He didn't move closer, but his eyes searched her face as though he was looking for the person he once knew beneath the woman standing before him. "Maybe not," he said softly. "But I had to see for myself. I don't even know why, but I couldn't stop thinking about you." She wanted to laugh, to tell him he had no right to think about her after what he'd done, but her voice failed her. The silence between them stretched painfully. She finally turned away, focusing on locking the drawer behind the counter, hoping he wouldn't notice her trembling hands. "You left me with nothing but memories, Christian." "You made sure of that," she said quietly. "You told me to disappear, so I did. And you don't get to walk back in because you suddenly feel nostalgic." Her words came out sharp, but her heart was pounding with something far more complicated than anger. He looked at her then, his face shadowed by something heavy, almost haunted. "I was wrong," he said after a long pause. "I didn't understand what I was losing. I thought I was protecting my future, but I destroyed it instead." His confession hung in the air like a wound reopening. She didn't want to believe him, didn't want to let herself hope. The pain was still there, buried deep, and it was safer to keep it untouched. But as she stood there, struggling to hold herself together, a small voice called from behind the counter. "Mommy?" Emma froze. Christian's eyes shifted toward the sound, confusion and shock flickering across his face. Before she could stop her, Lily peeked out from behind the counter, her golden hair catching the last light from the window. For a moment, the room went silent, the world narrowing into a single breath. Christian's gaze fell on the little girl, and something inside him shattered. The shape of her face, the color of her eyes, his eyes, left no room for denial. Emma's heart dropped as she saw realization spread through him, raw and unstoppable. He took a step forward, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Emma, is she?" Emma's throat tightened. The moment she had feared for 5 long years had come, and she felt utterly unprepared. She placed a protective hand on Lily's shoulder and nodded slowly, her voice trembling when she finally spoke. "Yes, Christian. This is Lily, your daughter." The silence that followed was absolute, filled with the weight of years and choices neither could take back. And in that silence, something irreversible changed between them, something neither of them could yet understand. For a long time, Christian didn't speak. The sound of the city outside faded into nothing as he stood there, staring at the little girl who had just turned his world inside out. His chest felt too tight, his throat dry. He had imagined 1,000 scenarios for this moment: if he ever saw Emma again, what he would say, how he would apologize. But nothing could have prepared him for the sight of the child with blue eyes that mirrored his own. She was small, delicate, with a soft curiosity in her expression. And yet there was a strength there, something familiar that made his heart twist painfully. Emma stood frozen, torn between wanting to shield her daughter and wanting to run. Lily clung to her mother's hand, sensing the tension, her little brow furrowing as she looked up at the stranger whose gaze wouldn't leave her. Christian finally found his voice, but it came out hoarse, barely audible. "How old is she?" Emma hesitated, her lips parting as if the words physically hurt. 5, she said simply, and the number hit him like a blow. He could feel the years he'd lost, the moments he'd never had, the first steps, the first words, the first everything, all the milestones he hadn't been there to see because of his own arrogance, his blind pride. He took a small step forward, and Emma instinctively shifted to stand slightly in front of Lily. "Don't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, just don't." Christian stopped immediately, raising his hands as if surrendering. "Emma, I swear I didn't know. If I had known." She cut him off with a bitter laugh that cracked halfway through. "You would have believed me? You would have listened? You called me a liar. You said I ruined your life." The words landed heavy in the space between them, pulling the air out of the room. He wanted to say something, anything, to undo the past, but nothing came. His mind raced with memories of that night years ago, the argument, his anger, his disbelief. He had been so sure, so convinced that she had betrayed him somehow. And now, standing here in front of the truth, he felt the crushing weight of what he had done. His voice finally broke through the silence, low and raw. "I was wrong. I was angry, and I took it out on you because I couldn't handle what I felt. I thought you were trying to trap me, but it was me. I was the one trapped in my own fear." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away before they could fall. "You don't get to explain it now," she said softly. "You don't get to walk in and fix this with words. You weren't there when she had a fever at 3 in the morning. You weren't there when she asked why all the other kids had dads who came to the park. You don't get to ask for forgiveness just because it's convenient for you now." Her words should have pushed him away, but they only made him take another step forward, this time slower, his voice steady but gentle. "You're right. I don't deserve forgiveness. But please, Emma, I need to know her. I can't walk away again. Not after seeing her." Emma turned away, running a hand through her hair as if to hold herself together. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust herself around him. But when she looked at Lily, who was staring up at Christian with quiet curiosity, something inside her shifted. She couldn't deny her daughter the truth. Not forever. She took a long breath and crouched beside Lily. "Sweetheart," she said softly, this is someone Mommy used to know." Lily tilted her head, her little voice filled with innocence. "Does he work with you, Mommy?" Emma almost smiled, but the pain in her chest kept it from reaching her eyes. "No, baby," she whispered. "He's someone from before." Christian knelt slowly so he could be closer to Lily's height, careful not to frighten her. His heart felt like it was breaking open in his chest as he met her gaze. "Hi," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Christian." Lily studied him for a moment, her tiny hand still wrapped around her mother's fingers, then gave a small, shy smile. "Hi," she replied, and for the briefest second, something fragile and beautiful filled the air between them. Emma watched the exchange, her heart caught between anger and something dangerously close to hope. Christian's voice trembled when he spoke again, directed at her this time. "Please, Emma, I know I can't change the past, but let me make it right. Let me at least try to be here now." She shook her head slowly, torn between fury and exhaustion. "You think it's that simple? That you can just show up and claim the years you missed? He exhaled shakily, his blue eyes pleading. No, but I'm not leaving until you tell me to. I'll do whatever it takes. You have my word. That night, after he left, Emma sat by Lily's bed, watching her daughter sleep. The child's face was peaceful, the kind of peace that only innocence could carry. Emma's mind replayed every second of what had just happened. Every word, every look. She hated that a part of her heart still reacted to him. That a single conversation had reopened wounds she had spent years closing. But beneath the fear, beneath the anger, there was something else, something she couldn't name yet. The truth was, she had spent years wondering what it would be like if he saw their daughter, if he realized what he had lost. Now that it had finally happened, the moment didn't feel like closure. It felt like the beginning of something she didn't know how to face. Across the city, Christian sat alone in his apartment, his mind a storm of emotions he couldn't contain. He kept seeing Lily's face, the way she had smiled at him, the way her voice sounded when she said hello. It was haunting and healing all at once. He had missed 5 years of her life, and he didn't know if there was any way to make up for that. But he knew one thing for certain, he couldn't walk away this time. He had built his life on power, on control, on money. And none of it meant anything now. All that mattered was a little girl with blue eyes, and the woman he had pushed away. For the first time in his life, Christian Blake didn't know what came next, but he knew he had to try. The following days unfolded with an intensity neither Emma nor Christian had expected. The first encounter had left both shaken, their worlds tilted by emotions they had buried for years. Emma tried to return to normalcy, to pretend that seeing him again hadn't stirred something deep and unresolved inside her. Yet every time she closed her eyes, she saw his expression when he looked at Lily, a mixture of awe, guilt, and tenderness that had burned into her memory. She couldn't escape the thought that no matter how much she hated what he'd done, he was still her daughter's father. And despite everything, she couldn't deny that Lily deserved to know him, even if it terrified her to open that door. For his part, Christian couldn't focus on work anymore. His board members noticed his distraction. His assistant whispered about his uncharacteristic silence, but he ignored them all. He had spent his life chasing power, convincing himself it would fill the emptiness. And yet, one small child had undone everything he thought he knew about himself. Each night he replayed every missed moment, the first birthday he hadn't attended, the Christmas mornings he hadn't been there for, the tears and laughter he hadn't shared. The regret was suffocating, a constant ache that kept him awake long after the city had fallen asleep. He began driving by the bookstore more often, always parking at a distance, never going in. He didn't want to push her too soon, but he needed to know they were real, that they hadn't vanished like a dream. It was on the 4th evening after their confrontation that fate decided to test them again. Emma had taken Lily to the park to enjoy one of the rare mild winter afternoons. The snow had melted just enough to reveal patches of green, and Lily ran ahead with her small red mittens, chasing pigeons and laughing so hard that Emma couldn't help but smile despite herself. For a few hours, the world felt normal again. But when she turned to grab their thermos of cocoa from the bench, her heart nearly stopped. Christian was there, standing a few feet away, his hands in his coat pockets, his expression uncertain. He hadn't meant to approach them. He had been walking by when he saw Lily playing, her laughter echoing through the park like a melody he couldn't ignore. He had stopped without thinking, and before he knew it, Emma had seen him. Their eyes met, and the air between them thickened with unspoken tension. Emma hesitated, her instinct telling her to turn and leave. But Lily had already noticed him. "Mommy, it's the man from the store," she said brightly, tugging at her mother's hand. Emma swallowed hard, forcing a calm smile. "Yes, sweetheart. It's him." Christian took a slow step forward, crouching down to Lily's level. "Hi again," he said softly. "Are you having fun?" Lily nodded shyly, holding out a small snowball. "I'm making a snowman," she said proudly. Want to help? Emma's heart twisted at the sight. Christian hesitated for a second, then smiled, a real smile, one she hadn't seen in years. I'd love to, he said. Together they knelt in the snow, their laughter mingling with Lily's as they built a crooked little snowman with twigs for arms and a pinecone for a nose. For a few moments, it didn't feel like the past was hanging over them. It was simple, easy, almost peaceful. Watching them together was like watching two pieces of a puzzle finally fit. And that realization made Emma's chest ache. When Lily ran off to find another stick, Christian stood and looked at Emma. Thank you, he said quietly. For letting me have this moment. She shook her head, her voice low. I didn't let you. Lily did. She doesn't know the history between us. He nodded, his gaze somber. Then let me make new history with her. Please. I don't expect forgiveness, Emma. I just want the chance to be there, to know her. Emma sighed, rubbing her arms against the cold. You think I can just trust you again after everything? After you threw me away? He didn't flinch this time. No, I don't expect you to trust me, but I'm asking you to let me earn it. The sincerity in his tone disarmed her. She wanted to stay angry to protect herself. But there was something different about him now, something broken and real. You say that now, she murmured. But what happens when it gets hard? When it's not easy or convenient? He looked at her, his blue eyes steady. Then I'll stay anyway, for her, for you, for what I destroyed. The words hung in the air, fragile and heavy, and for the first time, Emma didn't know how to answer. Over the following weeks, Christian began appearing more often, always careful not to overstep. Sometimes he would stop by the bookstore and bring Lily a small gift, a new storybook, a chocolate bar, a stuffed toy. Other times he would join them for walks in the park, sitting quietly as Lily chattered about her drawings and dreams. Emma watched him closely, waiting for the moment he'd grow tired, expecting him to disappear the way he had before. But he didn't. He was patient, consistent, and to her surprise, kind. Slowly, the wall around her heart began to crack. One night, after putting Lily to bed, Emma stood by the window and looked out at the city lights. Christian had just left after helping fix a broken shelf in the apartment. It had been so strange having him there, his presence familiar and foreign all at once. When she closed her eyes, she could still hear his quiet laugh, still feel the warmth of his hands as they worked side by side. She hated that it felt so natural, so safe. She hated that a part of her still remembered what it felt like to love him. But above all, she hated that she was starting to believe he might have changed. Across town, Christian sat in his car outside his building, unable to go inside. His reflection in the windshield looked like a stranger. For years, he had lived for ambition, driven by the need to be untouchable. But now he understood how empty it all was. The love he had thrown away had built a life without him, a life full of laughter, warmth, and the kind of happiness money couldn't buy. And yet somehow he had been given another chance to touch that light again. He swore to himself right there in the quiet of the night that he would not waste it. Whatever it took, he would make things right, not just for his daughter, but for the woman he had never stopped loving. Spring came slowly that year, melting the last of the snow and filling the city with the sound of rain and new beginnings. Emma found herself walking through those months in a haze of quiet confusion, balancing between the safety of the life she had built alone and the unpredictable warmth of the one that was slowly returning to her. Christian had become a steady presence, careful, gentle, never demanding too much. He showed up to pick Lily up from preschool, stood at the back of the auditorium during her little performances, and learned how to braid her hair badly enough that it made her laugh. Every small gesture chipped away at the walls Emma had built around her heart. She wanted to resist it, to remind herself that this man had once broken her so completely she thought she'd never heal. But each time she saw the way he looked at their daughter, like she was the most precious thing in the world, her anger softened a little more. Lily adored him. It was both beautiful and terrifying to watch. She would wait for him by the window every Friday evening, her small face lighting up when she saw his car pull up outside. He always brought something small, a flower he'd picked, a paper airplane, a drawing he'd made for her during meetings. And every time she would throw her arms around his neck as if she'd known him her whole life. Emma would watch from a distance, her heart aching with the knowledge that this was how it should have been all along. But there were still nights when she lay awake, wondering if she was making a mistake by letting him in again. She remembered too clearly the words he had thrown at her, the coldness in his eyes, the way he had turned his back when she had needed him most. Love had cost her everything once, and she wasn't sure she could survive losing it again. Christian, on the other hand, had never been more certain of anything in his life. He knew he couldn't erase the past, but he was determined to prove with actions what his words could never repair. He made changes to his life that startled even his business partners, turning down deals that would take him abroad for months, leaving the office earlier, taking weekends off for the first time in years. When his colleagues asked what had changed, he only smiled faintly and said, "Priorities." The truth was, he finally understood what mattered. He no longer saw success as a skyscraper of numbers and achievements. It was the small moments, Lily's laughter, Emma's cautious smiles, the quiet dinners where no one spoke but everything felt right. One evening, after a long day, Emma found herself sitting on the balcony of her apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The air smelled of rain and blooming flowers. Christian joined her, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He didn't speak at first, just handed her the cup and sat beside her, their shoulders brushing slightly. For a while, they just sat in silence, listening to the hum of the city. Then he said quietly, "Do you ever think about how things might have been if I hadn't let you go?" She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the glow of the lights. "All the time," she admitted softly. "But thinking about it doesn't change what happened." He nodded slowly, his gaze heavy with regret. "No, it doesn't. But maybe it can change what comes next." She didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to tell him not to ruin this fragile peace by asking for more than she could give. But another part, the one she had been trying to silence for months, wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that people could change, that love could survive even after everything had gone wrong. Christian reached for her hand, hesitated for a moment, then took it gently. "Emma," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I know I don't deserve a second chance. I know I hurt you more than I can ever fix, but I love you. I never stopped. I see you with Lily and it kills me that I wasn't there for you both. But if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you and she deserve." Emma's eyes filled with tears. And for a moment, she couldn't speak. The sincerity in his words, the vulnerability in his expression, it was everything she had once begged him to show her, and everything she had stopped believing she would ever see. She looked down at their intertwined hands, then back at him. "You can't undo the past," she whispered. "But maybe you can help me build something better now." His breath caught slightly, and a small, disbelieving smile touched his lips. "That's all I want," he said. The weeks that followed were the beginning of something new. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments, old wounds that reopened without warning, nights when Emma pulled away out of fear, and mornings when Christian didn't know how to make it right. But they kept trying. Lily was their bridge, the small piece of magic that kept them moving forward, even when the past threatened to pull them back. One warm afternoon, as they walked together through the park where everything had begun to change, Lily ran ahead and turned to them with a grin. "Can we all live together now?" she asked innocently. Emma laughed softly, glancing at Christian, who smiled in that quiet, unguarded way she had come to recognize. "Maybe someday," Emma said, but her voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. That night, after putting Lily to bed, Emma stood by her daughter's door and watched her sleep. Christian came up behind her, his arms hesitating for a moment before wrapping gently around her waist. She leaned into him without thinking, her head resting against his shoulder. The city outside was quiet, the soft hum of life drifting through the open window. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. The pain of the past hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined her. What mattered now was the present, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her back, the soft breathing of their daughter down the hall, the fragile but undeniable hope that maybe, just maybe, this time they would get it right. Christian pressed a kiss to her temple, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for giving me another chance." Emma closed her eyes, her lips curving into a faint, tired smile. "Don't thank me," she said softly. "Just don't waste it." He held her tighter, and in that small, quiet moment, surrounded by everything they had lost and found again, they both understood that love wasn't about erasing mistakes. It was about choosing each other again and again, even after everything had broken. And as dawn crept over the skyline, painting the city in gold, Emma knew that somehow, against all odds, they had both finally come home.